Hello, first of all, I want to say happy St. Patrick's Day, and since today is St. Patrick's Day, I decided why not review the film Leprechaun Origins. Now, Leprechaun Origins is the 7th film in the Leprechaun series. However, this is considered to be a reboot of the Leprechaun franchise. Now, I already reviewed the Leprechaun movies a couple of years ago, so you can go check out those reviews if you want. If you go to my YouTube channel and go to my playlist, you'll find a playlist titled Leprechaun Reviews, and there would be my reviews on all the Leprechaun movies, and I will be putting this review on that playlist as well. Now, as I said, this film is considered to be a reboot of the Leprechaun franchise. However, this film is so radically different from the other Leprechaun films that I honestly don't really see what the point of considering this to be part of the Leprechaun series really was. Like, if they just promoted this as another horror film that just happens to feature a killer leprechaun, that would have been fine, but they're actually considering this to be the 7th film in the Leprechaun series, yet the film really bears no resemblance to the older Leprechaun movies. Now, the older Leprechaun movies were very much horror comedies. This one tries to be much darker and much more serious, and that would be fine, I guess, but the Leprechaun in the movie is nothing like the Leprechaun that you saw in the earlier Leprechaun movies. In the earlier Leprechaun movies, the Leprechaun pretty much looked like your stereotypical Leprechaun, except he was much uglier than you would think a Leprechaun would really be, and he made a lot of these really bad puns with, like, gold and stuff, but in the older movies, Warwick Davis played the Leprechaun, and the older Leprechaun movies aren't necessarily good movies by any means. In fact, they're actually pretty bad, but I enjoy the Leprechaun films for what they are, mainly because of Warwick Davis's performance as the Leprechaun, because as cheesy and as stupid as some of those films are, they still have a charm to them, mainly because of Warwick Davis's performance. Like, the older films are a lot of fun. Now, once again, this film is trying to be much darker than the other Leprechaun films are, which, once again, I wouldn't really mind, but there's really no resemblance between this film and the other Leprechaun films, so I don't really understand why they're really considering this to be part of the franchise when the film is so radically different from the other films in the series. The only real resemblance between this movie and the older films is there's a repeat of the line, "Fuck you, Lucky Charms," which is said in the original Leprechaun movie. Now, as I said, in the older Leprechaun films, the Leprechaun is played by Warwick Davis. In this film, the Leprechaun is played by a wrestler named Postl, I think is his last name. I don't know if I'm saying his last name right. Now, I don't know anything about wrestling, so I don't know much about the actor who they got to play the Leprechaun in this movie, but the Leprechaun in this movie also looks radically different from the Leprechaun from the older films. The Leprechaun in this movie, I will admit, does actually look kinda cool. Like, it's basically this, like, monster-like creature, and the Leprechaun doesn't talk at all throughout the whole movie. It just makes, like, grunts and stuff like that. So, once again, that's part of the reason why I don't think this movie should have really been considered part of the series, because the film is so radically different from the other films in the franchise. Now, the film is a reboot, but at the same time, pretty much all the Leprechaun movies were reboots of each other, because none of the Leprechaun films actually have any continuity with each other. Like, I would actually argue that the Leprechaun franchise is almost like an anthology franchise, because each movie is a standalone story that just happens to feature the Leprechaun as the main villain. You know, really the films have no continuity with each other. Now, when I reviewed these films a couple of years ago, I did come up with little fan theories on how the films connect to each other, but those were just really fan theories. Like, in reality, there's really no real continuity with any of the films. Now, the plot of Leprechaun Origins is it follows four friends who are backpacking through Ireland, and they come to this small village, and they meet this guy at this pub, and the guy starts telling them a little bit about the history of this village, and he offers for them to stay at this cabin in the woods, and they accept the offer, and they go out there, and long story short, when night falls, they end up getting attacked by a killer leprechaun, and it turns out that this guy actually locked them in there so this leprechaun can kill them. It turns out that this entire town knows about the leprechaun, and it turns out that they actually sacrifice people that they consider to be outsiders to the leprechaun, and it turns out that a few years earlier they discovered all this gold that belonged to the leprechaun and tried to steal the gold, and so now, unless they sacrifice people to the leprechaun would kill all of them, and that's the basic plot line of Leprechaun Origins. Now, I'll be honest, Leprechaun Origins really isn't that good of a movie. Like, I don't hate this movie, like, I don't think it's an absolutely terrible movie. The problem with this movie is it's very mediocre. Like, you've seen movies like this a billion times before. Like, it's your typical kind of like cabin in the woods kind of horror film, only this time it's a killer leprechaun, but really, the characters in the movie, they're not completely unlikable, they're just characters that you've seen a billion times before. Like, they're very stock characters, they're very kind of just cliched characters that you've seen in many other horror films of this type. You know, it's a very cliched movie. Now, I will admit, though, a lot of the stuff dealing with the small town and how they all know about the leprechaun, I actually thought that stuff was kind of interesting, but honestly, I wish that was the whole movie. I wish the movie would have focused more on the villagers and how they're dealing with this, because they have to sacrifice innocent people to this creature in order to protect their own people. I think that would have made a much more interesting movie if it focused more on the villagers, but instead it focuses more on these four friends who once again are very stock, cliched characters. Now, another issue with this movie is every time you see the leprechaun in this movie, you can hardly see the leprechaun, because every time you see it, it's always very dark, and the camera is always out of focus, and it's like shaky cam, and you can hardly see the leprechaun. And once again, I actually think the leprechaun looks kind of cool in this movie, but at least show it, though. Like, in the parts with the leprechaun, it's so physically dark that I could hardly even see this thing. You know, so that's another big problem with the movie. So overall, I personally didn't really care for Leprechaun Origins. I didn't despise it, I just thought it was very mediocre, and to be honest, as bad as the older Leprechaun movies were, I would rather watch those as opposed to this, because I still really enjoy the older Leprechaun movies, even though they are pretty bad movies, but, yo, honestly though, once again, I would rather watch those than this one. I just thought it was a very mediocre movie, and, yeah. I mean, check it out if you want out of curiosity, but I personally don't think it's a very good movie. But yeah, that's my review on Leprechaun Origins, and bye.